You're just an overpaid code maintenance guy. We don't need you, the VP sneered, tossing my pink slip. I walked out without a word and pulled my personal laptop. A single API deletion request was pending. Monday at 9 a.m. arrived, and his name flashed on my screen. To understand why his name was flashing on my screen and why I was locked out, you have to go back 8 years, to a time when Apex Retail Group was nothing more than a struggling e-commerce startup operating out of a cramped, drafty office in the warehouse district. Back then, they were processing barely $50,000 in transactions a week, and their website crashed every time. More than 50 people tried to check out at the same time. The founder, Richard Caldwell, hired me as the principal back-end architect because their database was a tangled mess of legacy code and their APIs were constantly failing. I spent the first 2 years sleeping under my desk, rewriting the entire transaction processing engine from scratch. I built a system we called Apex Flow, a highly optimized, scalable back-end architecture designed to handle thousands of concurrent checkout requests without dropping a single packet. I remember those early days with a strange kind of fondness. The office had exposed brick walls that let in the draft during winter, and the heating was constantly breaking. The server racks were crammed into a modified utility closet that smelled of ozone and hot dust. I was the only software engineer on the payroll, responsible for everything from database administration to front-end JavaScript tweaks. I spent weeks analyzing slow query logs, rewriting inefficient database joins, and setting up indexing strategies to keep the database from collapsing under the weight of holiday traffic. Every line of code in Apex Flow was written with my own hands. I knew the system's quirks, its vulnerabilities, and its strengths. I built it to survive, and it did. 4 years into the job, as the company began to grow rapidly and secure venture capital funding, I realized I could no longer manage the database clusters alone. The system had scaled from a few hundred daily orders to tens of thousands, and the database replication lag was becoming a constant threat to transaction integrity. That was when I hired Chloe Alvarez. Chloe was 29, held a master's degree in database systems, and possessed an analytical mind that could spot a query bottleneck in 10,000 lines of SQL. We worked in a small, quiet corner of the office, surrounded by dual monitor setups, terminal screens displaying real-time system performance graphs, and the rhythmic, mechanical clack-hacking of our keyboards. Together, we turned Apex Flow into a fortress. By our 8th year, the company had grown from a small startup into a retail giant, processing over $8.5 million in transactions every single day. We managed a complex web of microservices, database replicas, and caching layers that kept the entire operation running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But there was a secret built into the very core of Apex Flow, one that the executives either forgot or chose to ignore. Before I ever heard of Apex Retail Group, I ran a small software consulting firm called VanceNet Tech LLC. During those years, I spent countless nights developing a proprietary middleware tool called the CryptoPass API Gateway. It was a highly secure, custom-built API wrapper designed to handle high-volume, multi-currency credit card processing by encrypting transaction data before routing it to international banking networks. I had written the code in Go, optimizing the concurrency model to handle tens of thousands of requests per second with near-zero latency. It was my intellectual property, registered under my company name and protected by copyright law. When Apex decided to expand internationally, they realized they lacked the security infrastructure to process global transactions. Building a custom gateway from scratch would have taken their internal team at least 18 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Instead of waiting, Richard Caldwell agreed to license my proprietary CryptoPass API Gateway. We signed a formal non-exclusive software licensing and support agreement between Apex Retail Group and my personal company, VanceNet Tech LLC. The terms were straightforward. Apex would pay VanceNet Tech a monthly licensing fee of $1,200. The license was strictly non-transferable, and the agreement contained a critical clause stating that the license was valid only as long as I remained employed by Apex as the principal back-end architect, or until the monthly licensing fee remained unpaid for more than 30 consecutive days. If either condition was violated, the software license would automatically terminate, and any continued use of the gateway would constitute a direct infringement of federal copyright law under Title 17 of the United States Code. Because the monthly fee was relatively small compared to our multi-million-dollar operating budget, the accounts payable department paid it automatically every month, and the contract was filed away in a dusty drawer. Over the years, as we upgraded Apex Flow, we integrated the CryptoPass API gateway deeper and deeper into the transaction loop. It became the single point of failure. Every single order, whether it was a $10 t-shirt or a $5,000 home theater system, had to pass through my gateway to verify the payment and authorize the shipping manifest. To the corporate board, it was just a background utility, a minor line item on a spreadsheet that nobody bothered to read. SaaS. They assumed that once code was deployed, it belonged to the company forever, never bothering to check who actually owned the rights to the engine under the hood. Moreover, the physical security of the entire infrastructure was tightly locked down. All of our production databases on AWS were encrypted at rest using keys managed through the AWS Key Management Service. To prevent unauthorized access or accidental data deletion, the master key policies were configured so that they could only be modified using a combination of my personal root administrator IAM profile and a physical hardware security token, a YubiKey 5 FIPS module that Chloe kept attached to her lanyard at all times. The corporate network administrators had access to the staging servers and the front-end code, but the keys to the kingdom, the actual data containing the credit card records, customer profiles, and transaction ledgers of millions of users, were locked inside a digital vault that only Chloe and I could open. We had built this level of security not out of paranoia, but because we were handling highly sensitive customer data, and a single breach could have destroyed the company's reputation overnight. For 8 years, this setup worked perfectly. Richard Caldwell focused on raising venture capital and expanding the business, while Chloe and I made sure the infrastructure remained rock solid. But 6 months ago, Richard suffered a minor stroke and stepped back from daily operations, leaving the company in the hands of the board of directors. The board immediately brought in a new management team to prepare the company for a potential public offering. Their first major hire was Thomas Brody, a ruthless corporate ladder climber who had spent the last decade hopping from one tech firm to another, leaving a trail of hollowed-out engineering departments in his wake. Thomas was obsessed with metrics, spreadsheets, and cost-cutting. He knew very little about actual software engineering, but he knew how to present a slide deck to the board showing how much money he could save by eliminating high-salaried US-based engineering roles. He brought with him Linda Vance, a cold, calculating human resources director who specialized in executing rapid, legally bulletproof mass layoffs. Within 3 weeks of their arrival, the atmosphere in the office changed from a collaborative engineering environment to a tense, paranoid survival game. But Chloe and I ignored the noise, focusing on keeping the servers online, unaware that we were already marked as the primary targets for their cost-cutting spreadsheet. It began on a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the end of the fiscal quarter. Thomas Brody called a mandatory meeting in the main conference room, a glass-walled space that overlooked the city skyline. When Chloe and I walked in, we found Thomas sitting at the head of the long oak table, surrounded by 3 men in suits who looked out of place in our casual office environment. Thomas introduced them as the executive transition team from Dev Global Limited, an offshore IT consulting firm. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and announced that Apex had partnered with Dev Global to execute a comprehensive infrastructure modernization audit. He claimed that the goal was to streamline our back-end processes and identify redundancies in our current system architecture. I looked at the Dev Global representatives and then at the slide deck projected on the screen. The slides were filled with corporate buzzwords about synergy and global delivery models. But between the lines, the message was clear. They were planning to replace our entire internal engineering team with cheap offshore contract labor. Thomas turned his attention to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. He requested that Chloe and I immediately hand over all master credentials, root access codes, and administrative login information for our AWS production accounts to the Dev Global team. He also asked Chloe to surrender her physical hardware security token, claiming that the transition team needed unrestricted access to perform a full system scan and check for potential security vulnerabilities. I looked at Chloe, who was already shaking her head. As a professional database administrator, she knew that giving root database credentials to third-party contractors without a formal security audit was a violation of basic compliance standards. I told Thomas that we could not comply with his request. I explained that, under our established company security protocols, administrative credentials through a formal change management ticket, which had to be reviewed and signed off by the cybersecurity team. I added that Chloe's physical YubiKey was tied to her security clearance and could not be transferred to external personal personnel under any circumstances. Thomas's face flushed red, and he stood up, leaning over the table. He asked me if I was refusing a direct order from the Vice President of Engineering. I told him that I was not refusing his order, but rather adhering to the security guidelines that had kept our platform online for 8 years. I suggested that if he wanted to bypass these protocols, he would need to get written authorization from the board of directors. Thomas glared at me for a long moment, then slowly sat back down, a forced smile returning to his face. He said he understood my concerns and would handle the paperwork through the proper channels. But as we walked out of the conference room, I knew that Chloe and I had just signed our own death warrants. Thomas did not care about security or compliance. He only cared about his budget cuts and the massive bonus he would receive for reducing our department's payroll. For the next 3 days, the office felt like a waiting room for an execution. The Dev Global team sat in the empty desks near the server room, whispering among themselves and taking notes on our daily operations. They tried to shadow our work, asking questions about the database schemas and the transaction routing system. Chloe and I kept our answers brief and technical, giving them nothing more than what was already documented in the public system manuals. We knew what was coming, but we decided to play our cards close to our chests. I spent those days quietly backing up my personal development logs, cleaning my local workstation of any personal files, and ensuring that all of my documentation for the proprietary gateway was up to date. I was not going to leave them with any excuses to claim I had hidden information. The hammer fell on Friday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. My terminal screen suddenly went blank, and a prompt appeared stating that my administrative privileges had been suspended by the system administrator. Seconds later, my phone vibrated. It was a calendar invite from Linda Vance, the HR director, for a meeting in her office in 15 minutes. The title of the meeting was simply Operational Update. I looked over at Chloe's desk. She was already packing her notebooks into her backpack, her face pale but determined. We walked down the hallway together, the silence of the office pressing in on us. The other engineers in the department watched us walk past, their eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and fear. They knew that if the principal architect and senior DBA could be cut, none of them were safe. When we entered Linda's office, we found Thomas Brody sitting next to her, a folder of documents resting on his lap. Linda did not waste time with pleasantries. She handed us 2 identical packets and stated that due to corporate restructuring and the integration of our new offshore delivery model, our positions as principal backend architect and senior database administrator were being eliminated, effective immediately. She claimed that this was a standard corporate realignment and had nothing to do with our performance. I opened the packet and scanned the documents. It contains a standard separation agreement. In exchange for signing a comprehensive waiver releasing the company from all future legal claims, including wrongful termination and age discrimination, they were offering us a severance package equivalent to 2 weeks of salary. More importantly, the agreement stated that by signing, we would forfeit our quarterly performance bonuses, which were due to be paid out the following week. For both Chloe and me, those bonuses amounted to $15,000 each, money we had earned by keeping the platform stable during the holiday rush. I looked at Thomas and told him that our contracts guaranteed a quarterly bonus if the system uptime remained above 99.9%, which it had. Thomas smirked, shrugged his shoulders, and said that bonuses were discretionary, and that the board had decided to suspend all payments for terminated employees. Linda pushed a pen across the desk toward me, stating that if we did not sign the waiver before leaving the building, the severance offer would be withdrawn and we would leave with nothing. I looked at the waiver, then at Linda, and then at Thomas. I could see the greed in Thomas's eyes. He knew that by quitting our bonuses, he was saving the company $30,000, which would go directly toward his own cost-cutting metrics. I picked up the document, folded it in half, and slid it into my pocket. I told Linda that I would not be signing anything today and would have my legal counsel review the paperwork. Chloe followed my lead, refusing to sign the waiver and sliding her packet into her bag. Linda's expression hardened. She warned us that if we did not sign, we would get $0 in severance and would find it very difficult to secure references for our next jobs. I stood up, looked her dead in the eye, and told her that after 8 years of building this company's core infrastructure, I did not need her reference. I turned to Chloe, nodded, and we walked out of the office. Thomas followed us out, calling after us in the hallway. He demanded that we hand over the master passwords and the database encryption keys before we left. I stopped, turned around, and looked at him. I told him that all standard credentials were saved in the company's secure password manager, which his new offshore team should have access to. As for the master encryption keys, I told him that they were managed under the standard AWS security policies. I did not mention that those policies required my personal IAM profile and Chloe's physical YubiKey to be modified. I kept my face completely blank, said a quiet "understood," and walked toward the elevators. 2 security guards were already waiting for us at the lobby entrance, ready to escort us out of the building. An hour after the security guards escorted us from the building, Chloe and I sat at a corner table in a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop 3 blocks away from the headquarters. We had our laptops open, connected to the coffee shop's secure Wi-Fi network. Chloe ordered a cup of black coffee, while I stuck to hot green tea. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. We simply stared at our screens, the hum of the coffee grinder and the chatter of nearby patrons fading into the background. We were no longer employees of Apex Retail Group. We were now external actors, and the corporate entity that had used our labor for 8 years was about to discover what happens when you cut out the foundation of a house to save on the cost of the bricks. I opened my personal email and accessed the administrative dashboard for VanceNet Tech LLC. The first thing I checked was the billing history for the CryptoPass API gateway. As I suspected, the $1,200 licensing invoice for the previous month was marked as overdue by 16 days. Thomas Brody, in his infinite wisdom and desire to shave every possible dollar from the engineering budget, had flagged the invoice as an unnecessary expense and instructed the accounts payable department to hold the payment. He had assumed that the gateway was just another SaaS utility that would continue to run regardless of billing status, or that his offshore team could easily replicate it if it ever shut down. He did not realize that the gateway was not running on Apex's servers, but was hosted as a containerized microservice on an independent server cluster, owned and maintained by VanceNet Tech LLC. I drafted a formal email to the accounts department and copied Richard Caldwell's personal address, as well as the corporate legal department. In the email, I stated that due to non-payment of the monthly licensing fee for more than 15 consecutive days, and because my employment as the principal back-end architect had been terminated, the software licensing agreement for the CryptoPass API gateway was officially terminated, effective immediately. I cited Section 4, Clause B of the original contract, which declared that any continued use of the gateway software after the termination of the license would constitute a direct violation of federal copyright law under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106. I attached the original signed PDF of the contract to the email, hit send, and then opened my terminal window. With a few keystrokes, I logged into my personal GitHub account and deleted the private repository containing the deployment scripts, configuration files, and API endpoints for the gateway. Next, I accessed the Cloud Console for VanceNet Tech's servers. I located the active container running the routing daemon for the Apex Flow payment loop and initiated a clean shutdown command. Within 3 seconds, the container stopped, the routing paths were deleted, and the OAuth 2 security tokens used to validate transaction requests between Apex's servers and the credit card processors were invalidated. The bridge that carried $8.5 million in daily sales was gone. I closed the terminal window and turned to Chloe. She was looking at her own screen, her fingers hovering over her mechanical keyboard. She had her physical YubiKey inserted into her laptop's USB port, its gold contact point glowing a steady amber. Chloe explained that when she designed the database encryption scheme 4 years ago, she had anticipated a scenario where a rogue administrator might try to hijack the database or steal customer data. To prevent this, she had configured the AWS Key Management Service with a custom key policy. The policy stated that the master keys used to decrypt the production database clusters could only be accessed or modified if 2 independent security factors were present: my personal root IAM credential and the physical cryptographic signature generated by her hardware token. Because Thomas had terminated our corporate accounts, the staging credentials and the default administrator logins the offshore team had been given could still access the AWS console, but they could not modify the KMS key policies or request database decryption keys. The production databases were currently running, but the moment the system attempted a routine data rotation or a server restart, the database engine would need to request new decryption keys from the KMS vault. Chloe ran a script that updated the KMS key policy, revoking the trust relationship between the database servers and the corporate administrative accounts. She then locked the policy using her hardware token. The databases were now sealed. Any attempt by the offshore team to bypass the encryption or copy the data to an external drive would result in the KMS system immediately locking the database volumes and rendering the data unreadable, turning millions of customer records into useless, encrypted noise. We did not stop there. We knew that Thomas and Linda would try to claim we had sabotaged the system or committed a cybercrime. To protect ourselves, we needed to establish a clear legal boundary. I called Arthur Pendleton, Elena Rostova's uncle and a retired IP attorney who had spent 3 decades representing engineers in contract disputes. I explained the situation to Arthur, detailing the non-payment of the license, our termination, and the security configuration of the database. Arthur let out a dry chuckle over the phone. He told me that we were entirely within our legal rights. The software was my property, the license had been violated, and Chloe's refusal to hand over her physical security token was a matter of personal professional liability under cybersecurity compliance guidelines. Arthur spent the next 3 hours drafting a formal cease and desist letter. The letter was addressed directly to the CEO of Apex Retail Group and copied the legal department of Amazon Web Services, our hosting provider. The document stated that Apex Retail Group was no longer authorized to use the CryptoPass API gateway software, and that any attempt to bypass the security layers or access the encrypted database schemas without the proper licensing agreement would result in immediate legal action for copyright infringement and breach of contract. Arthur sent the letter via registered email and faxed a copy to their corporate offices. By the time we closed our laptops, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the coffee shop floor. The system was still running for the moment, but the clock was ticking. The weekend was ahead, a time when online traffic typically doubled, and the automated batch processes would begin running on Sunday night to prepare for the Monday morning rush. We packed our laptops into our bags, walked out into the cool evening air, and went our separate ways. We had set the mechanism in motion, and all we had to do now was wait for the weekend to end. At exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the automated monitoring alerts on my phone began to vibrate. Even though my corporate access had been revoked, the public status page for Apex Retail Group was visible, and it was lighting up like a Christmas tree. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking a cup of green tea, and watched the error rates climb. The checkout page was throwing 503 service unavailable errors, and the payment gateway response latency had spiked from 80 milliseconds to infinity. The system was trying to route transactions through the CryptoPass API gateway, but since my servers were offline, the checkout loops were timing out, leaving thousands of customers stranded at the payment page with pending authorization flags. By 9 o'clock, the situation had escalated into a full-scale operational collapse. According to online retail forums and social media, customers were complaining that their credit cards were being charged, but their orders were not being confirmed, or that they were receiving payment failure messages after entering their billing information. The platform was losing approximately $350,000 in sales every hour, and the customer support lines were completely jammed. Behind the scenes at the headquarters, the offshore team from Dev Global was in a state of complete panic. As Chloe later learned from a former colleague in the infrastructure team, the Dev Global engineers had attempted to bypass my gateway by rewriting the checkout service to route transactions directly to the credit card processors. But because they did not understand the custom OAuth 2 security layer or the encryption protocols I had built into the API, their requests were repeatedly rejected by the banking networks as potential fraudulent activity. In their desperation, the offshore team attempted a hard reboot of the main database servers, hoping that a system restart would clear the stuck transactions and reset the database connections. This was the exact trigger Chloe had prepared for. The moment the database servers went offline and attempted to spin back up, the operating system requested the decryption keys from the AWS Key Management Service. But because Chloe had locked the key policy and detached the corporate administrator accounts, the KMS Vault rejected the request. The database volumes remained completely encrypted and unreadable. The database engine refused to start, and the entire e-commerce platform went black. The company's core asset, the customer transaction database, was now a digital brick. My phone rang at exactly 9:15. The caller ID displayed Thomas Brody's corporate office number. I let it ring 3 times, set up a voice recorder on my laptop, and answered the call. Thomas did not bother to say hello. His voice was cracked and shaking with rage, and I could hear the sound of keyboards clicking and voices shouting in the background. He screamed into the receiver, accusing me of sabotaging the servers, hacking the database, and stealing company property. He threatened to call the police, file a complaint with the federal authorities, and sue me for every penny I owned. He claimed that I was going to prison for cyber terrorism and that he would make sure I never worked in the tech industry again. I waited for him to finish his tirade. I took a slow sip of my tea, kept my voice level and calm, and told him that his accusations were completely baseless. I explained that I had not touched their servers, modified their code, or accessed their network since my termination on Friday afternoon. I pointed out that the database was locked due to their own team's decision to perform a forced reboot, which triggered standard AWS security protocols that required Chloe's physical YubiKey to resolve. As for the payment gateway, I reminded him that it was the intellectual property of VanceNet Tech LLC and that the license had automatically terminated because Apex had failed to pay the monthly invoice, an invoice that Thomas himself had instructed the accounting department to skip. I added that Arthur Pendleton, my legal counsel, had sent a formal cease and desist letter to their legal department on Friday evening, and that any continued attempt by his offshore team to bypass or run my software was a federal copyright violation. Thomas went quiet for a few seconds, the sound of his heavy breathing coming through the line. When he spoke again, the anger was still there, but it was mixed with a desperate, panicked undertone. He told me that this was not a game and that the board was holding him personally responsible for the downtime. He demanded that I give him the master credentials and tell Chloe to bring her security token to the office immediately to unlock the servers. He promised that if we resolved the issue right now, he would authorize the release of our severance packages. I let out a soft laugh. I told him that our severance packages were worth a fraction of the $30,000 in bonuses he had quitted, and that I had no interest in his offer. I told him that if he wanted to resolve the system outage, he would need to speak with my lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, and negotiate a formal settlement to buy out the license for the gateway and hire us as independent consultants to restore the database. I gave him Arthur's phone number and office address. Thomas yelled that he would never negotiate with a blackmailer and slammed the phone down. I hung up the receiver, stopped the recording, and saved the audio file to my personal cloud drive. I knew that Thomas was bluffing. He had no legal ground to stand on, and every hour the site remained offline, his career was disintegrating. I called Chloe to update her on the conversation, and we decided to spend the rest of the day away from our laptops. We had done our part, and the corporate machine was now grinding itself to pieces. By Wednesday morning, the system had been offline for exactly 48 hours. The company had lost an estimated $16.8 million in gross sales, and the major retail partners who sold through our platform were threatening to file class action lawsuits for breach of service level agreements. The story of the outage had reached the trade press, and the company's valuation was dropping by the hour. Under pressure from the major institutional investors, Richard Caldwell, the founder and majority shareholder, stepped back in to assume control of the board. Richard did not take long to figure out the source of the problem. He located the faxed copy of Arthur Pendleton's cease and desist letter on the legal department's desk, read the original software licensing contract I had signed with him 8 years ago, and reviewed the HR logs. Within 2 hours, the board held an emergency meeting. Thomas Brody and Linda Vance were terminated for gross negligence, exposing the company to massive legal liabilities and violating the Federal Warning Act by executing a mass layoff of 15 U.S.-based engineers without the mandatory 60-day notice period. At noon on Wednesday, my phone rang again. This time, it was Richard Caldwell's assistant, asking if Chloe and I could meet Richard at Arthur Pendleton's law office at 2 o'clock. When we walked into Arthur's conference room, Richard was already sitting there, looking tired but calm. He stood up, shook our hands, and apologized for the way we had been treated. He admitted that bringing in Thomas Brody had been a disastrous mistake, and that he had not realized how deeply integrated my proprietary gateway was into the core system. He made it clear that he wanted to get the platform back online immediately, and was prepared to meet our terms. We sat down, and Arthur laid out our proposal on the table. The terms were non-negotiable. First, Apex Retail Group would purchase the full intellectual property rights and source code of the CryptoPass API gateway from VanceNet Tech LLC for a one-time buyout fee of $450,000. Second, the company would pay Chloe and me our full $15,000 quarterly bonuses, plus 6 months of salary as severance for the wrongful termination. Third, to get the system online and transition the databases and gateway to a new internal engineering team, Apex would hire Chloe and me as independent consultants for a period of 30 days. At a rate of $500 per hour, with a minimum guarantee of 80 hours of work, Richard reviewed the terms, looked at Arthur, and then at me. He knew that the cost of our settlement was a fraction of the millions they were losing. Every day the site remained dark. He picked up his pen and signed the agreement. Before we touched a single server or shared a password, Arthur waited for the bank transfers to clear. By Thursday morning, the funds were verified in our accounts. Chloe and I drove to the headquarters, where we were met not by security guards, but by the senior system administrators who had survived the layoffs. Chloe plugged her physical YubiKey into the server terminal, accessed the AWS Key Management Service, and authorized the rotation of the master database encryption keys. I redeployed the CryptoPass API gateway code to a clean corporate server, updated the DNS records, and generated a new set of OAuth 2 security tokens for the payment loop. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the server logs began to scroll again. Transactions were verified, database queries resolved, and the error rates dropped to 0. The platform was online. Over the next 4 weeks, we fulfilled our consulting contract. We spent our days documenting the system architecture, training the remaining administrators, and preparing the infrastructure for a secure transition. We worked on our own terms, arriving at 10 in the morning and leaving by 4 in the afternoon. The remaining staff treated us with a level of respect that bordered on awe. They had seen the corporate VP try to steamroll the engineering department, and they had seen the engineering department push back and win. On our final day, Chloe and I walked out of the building for the last time. We did not need security guards to show us the way, and we did not look back. With the $450,000 buyout fee, our bonuses, and the consulting earnings, we had more than $500,000 in capital. We rented a loft office in the design district, purchased high-end development workstations, and registered a new partnership under the name Vance Alvarez Consulting LLC. Sometimes when I am working late in our new office and drinking a cup of jasmine tea, I look at the old ceramic mug on my desk and think about Thomas Brody. I heard from a colleague that his career in the tech sector is effectively finished. No board will hire a VP whose cost-cutting metrics resulted in a $16 million system shutdown. The corporate world likes to view engineers as replaceable parts, lines on a spreadsheet that can be swapped out for cheaper alternatives. But they forget that the code they rely on does not write itself, and the systems they run are only as strong as the people who build them. We did not play their corporate game. We simply rewrote the rules.